HEIDI, by Johanna Spyri. Chapter 10. Another grandmother. There was much expectation and preparation about the house on the following evening, and it was easy to see that the lady who was coming was one whose opinion was highly thought of, and for whom everybody had a great respect. Tinette had a new white cap on her head, and Sebastian collected all the footstools he could find and placed them in convenient spots, so that the lady might find one ready to her feet whenever she chose to sit. Fräulein Rottenmeier went about surveying everything, very upright and dignified, as if to show that though a rival power was expected, her own authority was not going to be extinguished. And now the carriage came driving up to the door, and Tinette and Sebastian ran down the steps, followed with a slower and more stately step by the lady, who advanced to greet the guest. HEIDI had been sent up to her room and ordered to remain there until called down, as the grandmother would certainly like to see Clara alone first. HEIDI sat herself down in a corner and repeated her instructions over to herself. She had not to wait long before Tinette put her head in and said abruptly, "Go downstairs into the study." HEIDI had not dared to ask Fräulein Rottenmeier again how she was to address the grandmother. She thought the lady had perhaps made a mistake, for she had never heard anyone called by other than their right name. As she opened the study door, she heard a kind voice say, "Ah, here comes the child. Come along in and let me have a good look at you." HEIDI walked up to her and said very distinctly in her clear voice, "Good evening," and then wishing to follow her instructions called her what would be in English Mrs. Madam. "Well," said the grandmother, laughing, "is that how they address people in your home on the mountain?" "No," replied HEIDI gravely, "I never knew anyone with that name before." "Nor I either," laughed the grandmother again as she patted HEIDI's cheek. "Never mind, when I am with the children I am always grandmamma. You won't forget that name, will you?" "No, no," HEIDI assured her. "I often used to say it at home." "I understand," said the grandmother, with a cheerful little nod of the head. Then she looked more closely at HEIDI, giving another nod from time to time, and the child looked back at her with steady, serious eyes, for there was something kind and warm-hearted about this newcomer that pleased HEIDI, and indeed everything to do with the grandmother attracted her, so that she could not turn her eyes away. She had such beautiful white hair, and two long lace ends hung down from the cap on her head and waved gently about her face every time she moved, as if a soft breeze were blowing round her, which gave HEIDI a peculiar feeling of pleasure. "And what is your name, child?" the grandmother now asked. "I am always called HEIDI, but as I am now to be called Adelaide, I will try and take care." HEIDI stopped short, for she felt a little guilty. She had not yet grown accustomed to this name. She continued not to respond when Fräulein Rottenmeier suddenly addressed her by it, and the lady was at this moment entering the room. "Frau Sesemann will no doubt agree with me," she interrupted, "that it was necessary to choose a name that could be pronounced easily, if only for the sake of the servants." "My worthy Rottenmeier," replied Frau Sesemann, "if a person is called HEIDI and has grown accustomed to that name, I call her by the same, and so let it be." Fräulein Rottenmeier was always very much annoyed that the old lady continually addressed her by her surname only, but it was no use minding, for the grandmother always went her own way, and so there was no help for it. Moreover, the grandmother was a keen old lady, and had all her 5 wits about her, and she knew what was going on in the house as soon as she entered it. When on the following day Clara lay down as usual on her couch after dinner, the grandmother sat down beside her for a few minutes and closed her eyes. Then she got up again as lively as ever, and trotted off into the dining room. No one was there. "She is asleep, I suppose," she said to herself, and then going up to Fräulein Rottenmeier's room she gave a loud knock at the door. She waited a few minutes and then Fräulein Rottenmeier opened the door and drew back in surprise at this unexpected visit. "Where is the child, and what is she doing all this time?" "That is what I came to ask," said Frau Sesemann. "She is sitting in her room, where she could well employ herself if she had the least idea of making herself useful. But you have no idea, Frau Sesemann, of the out-of-the-way things this child imagines and does, things which I could hardly repeat in good society. I should do the same if I had to sit in there like that child, I can tell you. I doubt if you would then like to repeat what I did, in good society. Go and fetch the child and bring her to my room. I have some pretty books with me that I should like to give her." "That is just the misfortune," said Fräulein Rottenmeier with a despairing gesture. "What use are books to her? She has not been able to learn her ABC even, all the long time she has been here. It is quite impossible to get the least idea of it into her head, and that the tutor himself will tell you. If he had not the patience of an angel he would have given up teaching her long ago." "That is very strange," said Frau Sesemann. "She does not look to me like a child who would be unable to learn her alphabet. However, bring her now to me. She can at least amuse herself with the pictures in the books." Fräulein Rottenmeier was prepared with some further remarks, but the grandmother had turned away and gone quickly towards her own room. She was surprised at what she had been told about Heidi's incapacity for learning, and determined to find out more concerning this matter, not by inquiries from the tutor, however. Although she esteemed him highly for his uprightness of character, she had always a friendly greeting for him, but always avoided being drawn into conversation with him, for she found his style of talk somewhat wearisome. Heidi now appeared and gazed with open-eyed delight and wonder at the beautiful colored pictures in the books which the grandmother gave her to look at. All of a sudden, as the latter turned over one of the pages to a fresh picture, the child gave a cry. For a moment or two she looked at it with brightening eyes, then the tears began to fall, and at last she burst into sobs. The grandmother looked at the picture. It represented a green pasture, full of young animals, some grazing and others nibbling at the shrubs. In the middle was a shepherd leaning upon his staff and looking on at his happy flock. The whole scene was bathed in golden light, for the sun was just sinking below the horizon. The grandmother laid her hand kindly on Heidi's. "Don't cry, dear child, don't cry," she said. "The picture has reminded you perhaps of something. But see, there is a beautiful tale to the picture which I will tell you this evening, and there are other nice tales of all kinds to read and to tell again. But now we must have a little talk together, so dry your tears and come and stand in front of me, so that I may see you well. There, now we are happy again." But it was some little time before Heidi could overcome her sobs. The grandmother gave her time to recover herself, saying cheering words to her now and then. "There, it's all right now, and we are quite happy again." When at last she saw that Heidi was growing calmer, she said, "Now I want you to tell me something. How are you getting on in your school time? Do you like your lessons, and have you learned a great deal?" "Oh no," replied Heidi, sighing. "But I knew beforehand that it was not possible to learn." "What is it you think impossible to learn?" "Why, to read. It is too difficult." "You don't say so, and who told you that?" "Peter told me, and he knew all about it, for he had tried and could not learn it." "Peter must be a very odd boy then." "But listen, Heidi, we must not always go by what Peter says. We must try for ourselves. I am certain that you did not give all your attention to the tutor when he was trying to teach you your letters." "It's of no use," said Heidi in the tone of one who was ready to endure what could not be cured. Listen to what I have to say, continued the grandmother. You have not been able to learn your alphabet because you believed what Peter said, but now you must believe what I tell you, and I tell you that you can learn to read in a very little while, as many other children do, who are made like you and not like Peter. And now hear what comes after. You see that picture with the shepherd and the animals. Well, as soon as you are able to read you shall have that book for your own. And then you will know all about the sheep and the goats, and what the shepherd did, and the wonderful things that happened to him, just as if someone were telling you the whole tale. You'll like to hear about all that, won't you? Heidi had listened with eager attention to the grandmother's words and now with a sigh exclaimed, "Oh, if only I could read now! It won't take you long now to learn, that I can see. And now we must go down to Clara, bring the books with you," and hand in hand the two returned to the study. Since the day when Heidi had so longed to go home, and Fräulein Rottenmeier had met her and scolded her on the steps, and told her how wicked and ungrateful she was to try and run away, and what a good thing it was that Herr Sesemann knew nothing about it. A change had come over the child. She had at last understood that day that she could not go home when she wished as Diet had told her, but that she would have to stay on in Frankfurt for a long, long time, perhaps forever. She had also understood that Herr Sesemann would think it ungrateful of her if she wished to leave, and she believed that the grandmother and Clara would think the same. So there was nobody to whom she dared confide her longing to go home, for she would not for the world have given the grandmother, who was so kind to her, any reason for being as angry with her as Fräulein Rottenmeier had been. But the weight of trouble on the little heart grew heavier and heavier. She could no longer eat her food, and every day she grew a little paler. She lay awake for long hours at night, for as soon as she was alone and everything was still around her, the picture of the mountain with its sunshine and flowers rose vividly before her eyes, and when at last she fell asleep it was to dream of the rocks and the snowfield turning crimson in the evening light, and waking in the morning she would think herself back at the hut and prepare to run joyfully out into the sun. And then, there was her large bed, and here she was in Frankfurt far, far away from home. And Heidi would often lay her face down on the pillow and weep long and quietly so that no one might hear her. Heidi's unhappiness did not escape the grandmother's notice. She let some days go by to see if the child grew brighter and lost her downcast appearance. But as matters did not mend, and she saw that many mornings Heidi had evidently been crying before she came downstairs, she took her again into her room one day, and drawing the child to her said, "Now tell me, Heidi, what is the matter? Are you in trouble?" But Heidi, afraid if she told the truth that the grandmother would think her ungrateful, and would then leave off being so kind to her, answered, "Can't tell you." "Well, could you tell Clara about it?" "Oh, no, I cannot tell anyone," said Heidi in so positive a tone, and with a look of such trouble on her face, that the grandmother felt full of pity for the child. "Then, dear child, let me tell you what to do. You know that when we are in great trouble, and cannot speak about it to anybody, we must turn to God and pray Him to help, for He can deliver us from every care that oppresses us. You understand that, do you not? You say your prayers every evening to the dear God in heaven, and thank Him for all He has done for you, and pray Him to keep you from all evil, do you not?" "No, I never say any prayers," answered Heidi. "Have you never been taught to pray, Heidi? Do you not know even what it means?" "I used to say prayers with the first grandmother, but that is a long time ago, and I have forgotten them. That is the reason, Heidi, that you are so unhappy, because you know no one who can help you. Think what a comfort it is when the heart is heavy with grief to be able at any moment to go and tell everything to God, and pray Him for the help that no one else can give us, and He can help us and give us everything that will make us happy again. A sudden gleam of joy came into HEIDI's eyes. May I tell him everything? Everything. Yes, everything. HEIDI, everything. HEIDI drew her hand away, which the grandmother was holding affectionately between her own, and said quickly, "May I go?" "Yes, of course," was the answer, and HEIDI ran out of the room into her own, and sitting herself on a stool, folded her hands together and told God about everything that was making her so sad and unhappy, and begged Him earnestly to help her and to let her go home to her grandfather. It was about a week after this that the tutor asked Frau Sesamman's permission for an interview with her, as he wished to inform her of a remarkable thing that had come to pass. So she invited him to her room, and as he entered she held out her hand in greeting, and pushing a chair towards him, "I am pleased to see you," she said. "Pray sit down and tell me which brings you here." "Nothing bad. No complaints, I hope." "Quite the reverse," began the tutor. "Something has happened that I had given up hoping for, and which no one, knowing what has gone before, could have guessed, for, according to all expectations, that which has taken place could only be looked upon as a miracle, and yet it really has come to pass and in the most extraordinary manner, quite contrary to all that one could anticipate." "Has the child HEIDI really learned to read at last?" put in Frau Sesammann. The tutor looked at the lady in speechless astonishment. At last he spoke again. "It is indeed truly marvelous. Not only because she never seemed able to learn her ABC even after all my full explanations, and after spending unusual pains upon her, but because now she has learnt it so rapidly, just after I had made up my mind to make no further attempts at the impossible but to put the letters as they were before her without any dissertation on their origin and meaning, and now she has, as you might say, learnt her letters overnight, and started at once to read correctly, quite unlike most beginners, and it is almost as astonishing to me that you should have guessed such an unlikely thing." "Many unlikely things happen in life," said Frau Sesammann with a pleased smile. "Two things coming together may produce a happy result, as for instance, a fresh zeal for learning and a new method of teaching, and neither does any harm. We can but rejoice that the child has made such a good start and hope for her future progress." After parting with the tutor she went down to the study to make sure of the good news. There sure enough was HEIDI, sitting beside Clara and reading aloud to her, evidently herself very much surprised, and growing more and more delighted with the new world that was now open to her as the black letters grew alive and turned into men and things and exciting stories. That same evening HEIDI found the large book with the beautiful pictures lying on her plate when she took her place at table, and when she looked questioningly at the grandmother, the latter nodded kindly to her and said, "Yes, it's yours now, mine, to keep always even when I go home," said HEIDI, blushing with pleasure. "Yes, of course, yours forever," the grandmother assured her. "Tomorrow we will begin to read it." "But you are not going home yet, HEIDI." "Not for years," put in Clara. "When grandmother goes away, I shall want you to stay on with me." When HEIDI went to her room that night she had another look at her book before going to bed, and from that day forth her chief pleasure was to read the tales which belonged to the beautiful pictures over and over again. If the grandmother said, as they were sitting together in the evening, "Now HEIDI will read aloud to us," HEIDI was delighted, for reading was no trouble to her now, and when she read the tales aloud the scenes seemed to grow more beautiful and distinct, and then grandmother would explain and tell her more about them still, Still, the picture she liked best was the one of the shepherd leaning on his staff with his flock around him in the midst of the green pasture, for he was now at home and happy, following his father's sheep and goats. Then came the picture where he was seen far away from his father's house, obliged to look after the swine, and he had grown pale and thin from the husks which were all he had to eat. Even the sun seemed here to be less bright and everything looked gray and misty. But there was the third picture still to this tale. Here was the old father with outstretched arms running to meet and embrace his returning and repentant son, who was advancing timidly, worn out and emaciated and clad in a ragged coat. That was HEIDI's favorite tale, which she read over and over again, aloud and to herself, and she was never tired of hearing the grandmother explain it to her and Clara. But there were other tales in the book besides, and what with reading and looking at the pictures the days passed quickly away, and the time drew near for the grandmother to return home. Chapter 11. HEIDI gains in one way and loses in another. Every afternoon during her visit the grandmother went and sat down for a few minutes beside Clara after dinner, when the latter was resting, and Fräulein Rottenmeier, probably for the same reason, had disappeared inside her room. But 5 minutes sufficed her, and then she was up again, and HEIDI was sent for to her room, and there she would talk to the child and employ and amuse her in all sorts of ways. The grandmother had a lot of pretty dolls, and she showed HEIDI how to make dresses and pinafores for them, so that HEIDI learned how to sew and to make all sorts of beautiful clothes for the little people out of a wonderful collection of pieces that grandmother had by her of every describable and lovely color. And then grandmother liked to hear her read aloud, and the oftener HEIDI read her tales the fonder she grew of them. She entered into the lives of all the people she read about so that they became like dear friends to her, and it delighted her more and more to be with them. But still HEIDI never looked really happy, and her bright eyes were no longer to be seen. It was the last week of the grandmother's visit. She called HEIDI into her room as usual one day after dinner, and the child came with her book under her arm. The grandmother called her to come close, and then laying the book aside, said, "Now, child, tell me why you are not happy. Have you still the same trouble at heart?" HEIDI nodded and replied, "Have you told God about it?" "Yes." "And do you pray every day that He will make things right and that you may be happy again?" "No, I have left off praying." "Do not tell me that." "HEIDI, why have you left off praying? It is of no use. God does not listen." HEIDI went on in an agitated voice, "And I can understand that when there are so many people in Frankfurt praying to Him every evening that He cannot attend to them all, and He certainly has not heard what I said to Him." "And why are you so sure of that?" "HEIDI, because I have prayed for the same thing every day for weeks, and yet God has not done what I asked." "You are wrong, HEIDI. You must not think of Him like that. God is a good Father to us all, and knows better than we do what is good for us. If we ask Him for something that is not good for us, He does not give it, but something better still, if only we will continue to pray earnestly and do not run away and lose our trust in Him. God did not think what you have been praying for was good for you just now, but be sure He heard you, for He can hear and see everyone at the same time, because He is a God and not a human being like you and me, and because He thought it was better for you not to have at once what you wanted. He said to Himself, 'Yes, HEIDI shall have what she asks for, but not until the right time comes, so that she may be quite happy, if I do what she wants now.' And then one day she sees that it would have been better for her not to have had her own way. She will cry and say, 'If only God had not given me what I asked for, it is not so good as I expected.' And while God is watching over you, and looking to see if you will trust Him and go on praying to Him every day, and turn to Him for everything you want, you run away and leave off saying your prayers, and forget all about him. And when God no longer hears the voice of one he knew among those who pray to him, he lets that person go his own way, that he may learn how foolish he is. And then this one gets into trouble, and cries, "Save me, God, for there is none other to help me." And God says, "Why did you go from me? I could not help you when you ran away, and you would not like to grieve God, would you, HEIDI, when he only wants to be kind to you? So will you not go and ask him to forgive you, and continue to pray and to trust him? For you may be sure that he will make everything right and happy for you, and then you will be glad and light-hearted again." HEIDI had perfect confidence in the grandmother, and every word she said sunk into her heart. "I will go at once and ask God to forgive me, and I will never forget him again," she replied repentantly. "That is right, dear child," and anxious to cheer her, added, "Don't be unhappy, for he will do everything you wish in good time." And HEIDI ran away and prayed that she might always remember God, and that he would go on thinking about her. The day came for grandmother's departure, a sad one for Clara and HEIDI, but the grandmother was determined to make it as much like a holiday as possible and not to let them mope, and she kept them so lively and amused that they had no time to think about their sorrow at her going until she really drove away. Then the house seemed so silent and empty that HEIDI and Clara did not know what to do with themselves, and sat during the remainder of the day like two lost children. The next day, when the hour came for Clara and HEIDI to be together, the latter walked in with her book and proposed that she should go on reading aloud every afternoon to Clara, if the latter liked it. Clara agreed, and thought anyhow it would be nice for that day, so HEIDI began with her usual enthusiasm. But the reading did not last long, for HEIDI had hardly begun a tale about a dying grandmother before she cried out, "Oh, then grandmother is dead," and burst into tears, for everything she read was so real to her that she quite thought it was the grandmother at home who had died, and she kept on exclaiming as her sobs increased, "She is dead, and I shall never see her again, and she never had one of the white rolls." Clara did all she could to explain to HEIDI that the story was about quite a different grandmother, but even when at last she had been able to convince HEIDI of this, the latter continued to weep inconsolably, for now she had awakened to the thought that perhaps the grandmother, and even the grandfather also, might die while she was so far away, and that if she did not go home for a long time she would find everything there all silent and dead, and there she would be all alone, and would never be able to see the dear one she loved any more. Fräulein Rottenmeier had meanwhile come into the room, and Clara explained to her what had happened. As HEIDI continued her weeping, the lady, who was evidently getting impatient with her, went up to HEIDI and said with decision, "Now, Adelaide, that is enough of all this causeless lamentation. I will tell you once for all, if there are any more scenes like this while you are reading, I shall take the book away from you and shall not let you have it again." Her words had immediate effect on HEIDI, who turned pale with fear. The book was her one great treasure. She quickly dried her tears and swallowed her sobs as best she could, so that no further sound of them should be heard. The threat did its work, for HEIDI never cried aloud again whatever she might be reading, but she had often to struggle hard to keep back her tears, so that Clara would look at her and say, "What faces you are making, HEIDI! I never saw anything like it." But the faces made no noise and did not offend Fräulein Rottenmeier, and HEIDI, having overcome her fit of despairing misery, would go quietly on for a while, and no one perceived her sorrow. But she lost all her appetite, and looked so pale and thin that Sebastian was quite unhappy when he looked at her, and could not bear to see her refusing all the nice dishes he handed her. He would whisper to her sometimes, in quite a kind, fatherly manner. "Take a little. You don't know how nice it is. There, a good spoonful, now another." But it was of no use. Heidi hardly ate anything at all, and as soon as she laid her head down at night the picture of home would rise before her eyes, and she would weep, burying her face in the pillow that her crying might not be heard. And so many weeks passed away. Heidi did not know it was winter or summer, for the walls and windows she looked out upon showed no change, and she never went beyond the house except on rare occasions when Clara was well enough to drive out, and then they only went a very little way, as Clara could not bear the movement for long, so that on these occasions they generally only saw more fine streets and large houses and crowds of people. They seldom got anywhere beyond them, and grass and flowers, fir trees and mountains, were still far away. Heidi's longing for the old familiar and beautiful things grew daily stronger, so that now only to read a word that recalled them to her remembrance brought her to the verge of tears, which with difficulty she suppressed. So the autumn and winter passed, and again the sun came shining down on the white walls of the opposite houses, and Heidi would think to herself that now the time had come for Peter to go out again with the goats, to where the golden flowers of the cistus were glowing in the sunlight, and all the rocks around turned to fire at sunset. Heidi would go and sit in a corner of her lonely room and put her hands up to her eyes that she might not see the sun shining on the opposite wall, and then she would remain without moving, battling silently with her terrible homesickness until Clara sent for her again. Chapter 12. A Ghost in the House. For some days past Fräulein Rottenmeier had gone about rather silently and as if lost in thought. As twilight fell, and she passed from room to room, or along the long corridors, she was seen to look cautiously behind her, and into the dark corners, as if she thought someone was coming silently behind her and might unexpectedly give her dress a pull. Nor would she now go alone into some parts of the house. If she visited the upper floor where the grand guest chambers were, or had to go down into the large mysterious council chamber, where every footstep echoed, and the old senators with their big white collars looked down so solemnly and immovably from their frames, she regularly called Jeanette to accompany her, in case, as she said, there might be something to carry up or down. Jeanette on her side did exactly the same. If she had business upstairs or down, she called Sebastian to accompany her, and there was always something he must help her with which she could not carry alone. More curious still, Sebastian, also, if sent into one of the more distant rooms, always called John to go with him in case he should want his assistance in bringing what was required, and John readily obeyed, although there was never anything to carry, and either might well have gone alone, but he did not know how soon he might want to ask Sebastian to do the same service for him. And while these things were going on upstairs, the cook, who had been in the house for years, would stand shaking her head over her pots and kettles, and sighing, "That ever I should live to know such a thing," for something very strange and mysterious was going on in Herr Sesamman's house. Every morning, when the servants went downstairs, they found the front door wide open, although nobody could be seen far or near to account for it. During the first few days that this happened, every room and corner was searched in great alarm, to see if anything had been stolen, for the general idea was that a thief had been hiding in the house and had gone off in the night with the stolen goods. But not a thing in the house had been touched. Everything was safe in its place. The door was doubly locked at night, and for further security the wooden bar was fastened across it. But it was no good. Next morning the door again stood open. The servants in their fear and excitement got up extra early, but not so early but what the door had been opened before they got downstairs. although everything and everybody around were still wrapped in slumber, and the doors and windows of the adjoining houses all fast shut. At last, after a great deal of persuasion from Fräulein Rottenmeier, Sebastian and John plucked up courage and agreed to sit up one night in the room next to the large council chamber and to watch and see what would happen. Fräulein Rottenmeier looked up several weapons belonging to the master, and gave these and a bottle of spirits to Sebastian, so that their courage might not faint if it came to a fight. On the appointed night the two sat down and began at once to take some of the strengthening cordial, which at first made them very talkative and then very sleepy, so that they leant back in their seats and became silent. As midnight struck, Sebastian roused himself and called to his companion, who, however, was not easy to wake, and kept rolling his head first to one side and then the other and continuing to sleep. Sebastian began to listen more attentively, for he was wide awake now. Everything was still as a mouse. All sound had died away from the streets even. He did not feel inclined to go to sleep again, for the stillness was ghostly to him, and he was afraid now to raise his voice to rouse John, so he shook him gently to make him stir. At last, as one struck, John woke up, and came back to the consciousness of why he was sitting in a chair instead of lying in his bed. He now got up with a great show of courage and said, "Come, Sebastian, we must go outside and see what is going on. You need not be afraid, just follow me." Whereupon he opened the door wide and stepped into the hall. Just as he did so a sudden gust of air blew through the open front door and put out the light which John held in his hand. He started back, almost overturning Sebastian, whom he clutched and pulled back into the room, and then shutting the door quickly he turned the key as far as he could make it go. Then he pulled out his matches and lighted his candle again. Sebastian, in the suddenness of the affair, did not know exactly what had happened, for he had not seen the open door or felt the breeze behind John's broad figure. But now, as he saw the latter in the light, he gave a cry of alarm, for John was trembling all over and as white as a ghost. "What's the matter? What did you see outside?" asked Sebastian sympathetically. "The door partly open," gasped John, "and a white figure standing at the top of the steps. There it stood, and then all in a minute it disappeared." Sebastian felt his blood run cold. The two sat down close to one another and did not dare move again till the morning broke and the streets began to be alive again. Then they left the room together, shut the front door, and went upstairs to tell Fräulein Rottenmeier of their experience. She was quite ready to receive them, for she had not been able to sleep at all in the anxiety of waiting to hear their report. They had no sooner given her details of the night's experience than she sat down and wrote straight off to Herr Sesemann, who had never received such a letter before in his life. She could hardly write, she told him, for her fingers were stiff with fear, and Herr Sesemann must please arrange to come back at once, for dreadful and unaccountable things were taking place at home. Then she entered into particulars of all that had happened, of how the door was found standing open every morning, and how nobody in the house now felt sure of their life in this unprotected state of things, and how it was impossible to tell what terrible results might follow on these mysterious doings. Herr Sesemann answered that it was quite impossible for him to arrange to leave his business and return home at once. He was very much astonished at this ghost tale, but hoped by this time the ghost had disappeared. If, however, it still continued to disturb the household, would Fräulein Rottenmeier write to the grandmother and ask her if she could come and do something? She, he was sure, would soon find out a way to deal with the ghost so that it would not venture again to haunt his house. Fräulein Rottenmeier was not pleased with the tone of this letter. She did not think the matter was treated seriously enough. She wrote off without delay to Frau Sesemann, but got no more satisfactory reply from the quarter, and some remarks in the letter she considered were quite offensive. Frau Sesemann wrote that she did not feel inclined to take the journey again from Holstein to Frankfurt because Rottenmeier fancied she saw ghosts. There had never been a ghost in the house since she had known it, and if there was one now it must be a live one, with which Rottenmeier ought to be able to deal. If not, she had better send for the watchman to help her. Fräulein Rottenmeier, however, was determined not to pass any more days in a state of fear, and she knew the right course to pursue. She had as yet said nothing to the children of the ghostly apparitions, for she knew if she did that the children would not remain alone for a single moment, and that might entail discomfort for herself. But now she walked straight off into the study, and there in a low mysterious voice told the two children everything that had taken place. Clara immediately screamed out that she could not remain another minute alone. Her father must come home, and Fräulein Rottenmeier must sleep in her room at night, and Heidi too must not be left by herself, for the ghost might do something to her. She insisted that they should all sleep together in one room and keep a light burning all night, and Jeanette had better be in the next room, and Sebastian and John come upstairs and spend the night in the hall, so that they might call out and frighten the ghost the instant they saw it appear on the steps. Clara, in short, grew very excited, and Fräulein Rottenmeier had great difficulty in quieting her. She promised to write at once to her father, and to have her bed put in her room and not to be left alone for a moment. They could not all sleep in the same room, but if Heidi was frightened, why Jeanette must go into her room. But Heidi was far more frightened of Jeanette than of ghosts, of which the child had never before heard, so she assured the others she did not mind the ghost, and would rather be alone at night. Fräulein Rottenmeier now sat down to write another letter to Herr Sesemann, stating that these unaccountable things that were going on in the house had so affected his daughter's delicate constitution that the worst consequences might be expected. Epileptic fits and St. Vitus's dance often came on suddenly in cases like this, and Clara was liable to be attacked by either if the cause of the general alarm was not removed. The letter was successful, and 2 days later Herr Sesemann stood at his front door and rang the bell in such a manner that everybody came rushing from all parts of the house and stood looking affrighted at everybody else, convinced that the ghost was impudently beginning its evil tricks in daylight. Sebastian peeped cautiously through a half-closed shutter. As he did so there came another violent ring at the bell, which it was impossible to mistake for anything but a very hard pull from a non-ghostly hand, and Sebastian recognized whose hand it was, and rushing pell-mell out of the room, fell heels over head downstairs, but picked himself up at the bottom and flung open the street door. Herr Sesemann greeted him abruptly and went up without a moment's delay into his daughter's room. Clara greeted him with a cry of joy, and seeing her so lively and apparently as well as ever, his face cleared, and the frown of anxiety passed gradually away from it as he heard from his daughter's own lips that she had nothing the matter with her, and moreover was so delighted to see him that she was quite glad about the ghost, as it was the cause of bringing him home again. "And how is the ghost getting on?" he asked, turning to Fräulein Rottenmeier, with a twinkle of amusement in his eye. "It is no joke, I assure you," replied that lady. "You'll not laugh yourself tomorrow morning, Herr Sesemann. What is going on in the house points to some terrible thing that has taken place in the past and been concealed." "Well, I know nothing about that," said the master of the house, "but I must beg you not to bring suspicion on my worthy ancestors. And now will you kindly call Sebastian into the dining room, as I wish to speak to him alone." Herr Sesemann had been quite aware that Sebastian and Fräulein Rottenmeier were not on the best of terms, and he had his ideas about this scare. "Come here, lad," he said as Sebastian appeared, "and tell me frankly, have you been playing at ghosts to amuse yourself at Fräulein Rottenmeier's expense?" "No, on my honor, sir. Pray, do not think it. I am very uncomfortable about the matter myself," answered Sebastian with unmistakable truthfulness. "Well, if that is so, I will show you and John tomorrow morning how ghosts look in the daylight. You ought to be ashamed of yourself, Sebastian, a great strong lad like you, to run away from a ghost. But now go and take a message to my old friend the doctor. Give him my kind regards, and ask him if he will come to me tonight at 9 o'clock without fail. I have come by express from Paris to consult him. I shall want him to spend the night here. So bad a case is it, so he will arrange accordingly. You understand?" "Yes, sir," replied Sebastian. "I will see to the matter as you wish." Then Herr Sesemann returned to Clara, and begged her to have no more fear, as he would soon find out all about the ghost and put an end to it. Punctually at 9 o'clock, after the children had gone to bed and Fräulein Rottenmeier had retired, the doctor arrived. He was a gray-haired man with a fresh face, and two bright, kindly eyes. He looked anxious as he walked in, but, on catching sight of his patient, burst out laughing and clapped him on the shoulder. "Well," he said, "you look pretty bad for a person that I am to sit up with all night." "Patience, friend," answered Herr Sesemann. "The one you have to sit up for will look a good deal worse when we have once caught him. So there is a sick person in the house, and one that has first to be caught. Much worse than that, doctor, a ghost in the house. My house is haunted." The doctor laughed aloud. "That's a nice way of showing sympathy, doctor," continued Herr Sesemann. "It's a pity my friend Rottenmeier cannot hear you. She is firmly convinced that some old member of the family is wandering about the house doing penance for some awful crime he committed." "How did she become acquainted with him?" asked the doctor, still very much amused. So Herr Sesemann recounted to him how the front door was nightly opened by somebody, according to the testimony of the combined household, and he had therefore provided 2 loaded revolvers, so as to be prepared for anything that happened, for either the whole thing was a joke got up by some friend of the servants, just to alarm the household while he was away, and in that case a pistol fired into the air would procure him a wholesome fright, or else it was a thief, who, by leading everybody at first to think there was a ghost, made it safe for himself when he came later to steal, as no one would venture to run out if they heard him, and in that case too a good weapon would not be amiss. The 2 took up their quarters for the night in the same room in which Sebastian and John had kept watch. A bottle of wine was placed on the table, for a little refreshment would be welcome from time to time if the night was to be passed sitting up. Beside it lay the 2 revolvers, and 2 good-sized candles had also been lighted, for Herr Sesemann was determined not to wait for ghosts in any half-light. The door was shut close to prevent the light being seen in the hall outside, which might frighten away the ghost, and now the 2 gentlemen sat comfortably back in the armchairs and began talking of all sorts of things, now and then pausing to take a good draught of wine, and so 12 o'clock struck before they were aware. "The ghost has got scent of us and is keeping away tonight," said the doctor. "Wait a bit. It does not generally appear before 1 o'clock, answered his friend. They started talking again. 1 o'clock struck. There was not a sound about the house, nor in the street outside. Suddenly the doctor lifted his finger. "Hush, Sesemann, don't you hear something?" They both listened, and they distinctly heard the bar softly pushed aside and then the key turned in the lock and the door opened. Herr Sesamon put out his hand for his revolver. "You are not afraid, are you?" said the doctor as he stood up. "It is better to take precautions," whispered Herr Sesamon, and, seizing one of the lights in his other hand, he followed the doctor who, armed, in like manner with a light and a revolver, went softly on in front. They stepped into the hall. The moonlight was shining in through the open door and fell on a white figure standing motionless in the doorway. "Who is there?" thundered the doctor in a voice that echoed through the hall. As the two men advanced with lights and weapons towards the figure, it turned and gave a low cry. There in her little white nightgown stood HEIDI, with bare feet, staring with wild eyes at the lights and the revolvers, and trembling from head to foot like a leaf in the wind. The two men looked at one another in surprise. "Why, I believe it is your little water carrier, Sesamon," said the doctor. "Child, what does this mean?" said Herr Sesamon. "What did you want? Why did you come down here?" White with terror, and hardly able to make her voice heard, HEIDI answered, "I don't know." But now the doctor stepped forward. "This is a matter for me to see to. Sesamon, go back to your chair. I must take the child upstairs to her bed." And with that he put down his revolver and, gently taking the child by the hand, led her upstairs. "Don't be frightened," he said as they went up side by side. "It's nothing to be frightened about. It's all right. Only just go quietly." On reaching HEIDI's room, the doctor put the candle down on the table, and taking HEIDI up in his arms, laid her on the bed and carefully covered her over. Then he sat down beside her and waited until HEIDI had grown quieter and no longer trembled so violently. He took her hand and said in a kind, soothing voice, "There, now you feel better, and now tell me where you were wanting to go to." "I did not want to go anywhere," said HEIDI. "I did not know. I went downstairs, but all at once I was there." "I see. And had you been dreaming, so that you seem to see and hear something very distinctly?" "Yes, I dream every night, and always about the same things. I think I am back with the grandfather, and I hear the sound in the fir trees outside, and I see the stars shining so brightly, and then I open the door quickly and run out, and it is all so beautiful. But when I wake I am still in Frankfurt." And HEIDI struggled as she spoke to keep back the sobs which seemed to choke her. "And have you no pain anywhere? No pain in your head or back?" "No, only a feeling as if there were a great stone weighing on me here, as if you had eaten something that would not go down." "No, not like that. Something heavy, as if I wanted to cry very much." "I see. And then do you have a good cry?" "Oh, no, I mustn't. Fräulein Rottenmeier forbade me to cry." "So you swallow it all down, I suppose? Are you happy here in Frankfurt?" "Yes," was the low answer, but it sounded more like no. "And where did you live with your grandfather?" "Up on the mountain." "That wasn't very amusing. Rather dull at times, eh?" "No, no, it was beautiful, beautiful." HEIDI could go no further. The remembrance of the past, the excitement she had just gone through, the long suppressed weeping, were too much for the child's strength. The tears began to fall fast, and she broke into violent weeping. The doctor stood up and laid her head kindly down on the pillow. "There, there, go on crying. It will do you good, and then go to sleep. It will be all right tomorrow." Then he left the room and went downstairs to Herr Sesamon. When he was once more sitting in the armchair opposite his friend, "Sesamon," he said, "let me first tell you that your little charge is a sleepwalker. She is the ghost who has nightly opened the front door and put your household into this fever of alarm. Secondly, the child is consumed with homesickness, to such an extent that she is nearly a skeleton already, and soon will be quite one. Something must be done at once. For the first trouble, due to her overexcited nerves, There is but one remedy, to send her back to her native mountain air, and for the second trouble there is also but one cure, and that the same. So tomorrow the child must start for home. There you have my prescription." Herr Sesemann had arisen and now paced up and down the room in the greatest state of concern. "What?" he exclaimed. "The child a sleepwalker and ill, homesick, and grown emaciated in my house. All this has taken place in my house and no one seen or known anything about it." "And you mean, doctor, that the child who came here happy and healthy, I am to send back to her grandfather a miserable little skeleton? I can't do it. You cannot dream of my doing such a thing. Take the child in hand, do with her what you will, and make her whole and sound, and then she shall go home. But you must do something first, Sesemann," replied the doctor. "Consider what you are doing. This illness of the child's is not one to be cured with pills and powders. The child has not a tough constitution. But if you send her back at once she may recover in the mountain air. If not, you would rather she went back ill than not at all." Herr Sesemann stood still. The doctor's words were a shock to him. "If you put it so, doctor, there is assuredly only one way, and the thing must be seen to at once." And then he and the doctor walked up and down for a while arranging what to do, after which the doctor said goodbye. For some time had passed since they first sat down together, and as the master himself opened the hall door this time the morning light shone down through it into the house.